Welcome to the Deep Dive. This is where we take the materials you send our way, articles, notes, research, whatever it might be.
And we really try to cut through the noise, get right to the core insights from within those sources themselves.
Exactly. We're here to help you navigate the information, focusing only on what the source material highlights as important.
And for this particular deep dive, we're looking at a source that really zeroes in on recent events and statements around Donald Trump. It presents a pretty specific viewpoint on his leadership, public appearances, things like that.
Right. So our mission today is pretty straightforward. We're just exploring the specific points, the claims, the observations that this source puts forward. We're sticking strictly to what's in front of us.
No outside info, definitely not taking political sides. It's purely about understanding the narrative and the information presented in this specific source.
That's the plan. We want to give you a clear picture of the source's perspective, based only on the material provided.
Okay, so where does the source start?
All right, let's jump in. So the source opens its account by focusing pretty heavily on a specific incident. It's Donald Trump's fall, or a stumble maybe, walking up the steps of Air Force One.
Ah, right. Leaving Bedminster for Camp David. I remember seeing that mentioned. The source really dwells on it.
It does. It describes him nearly face-planting and says its video shows it from multiple angles.
Okay. And does it highlight anything specific about the fall itself?
Yeah, it makes a point about his grip on the handrail. The source uses the phrase death grip, actually.
Death grip, wow. And depicts it as a real struggle.
That's the word they use, yeah, struggle.
And it seems like the source uses that physical moment to pivot a bit.
It really does. It springboards right into speculation. The source mentions comments suggesting maybe a medical device or even a catheter might be visible if you zoom in on images from around that time.
Okay. So speculation based on zoomed-in images. And the source links this to other things.
Right. It connects it back, supposedly, to past comments the source has referenced before. And their conclusion, after looking closely, is that it looks like, and this is their quote, some sort of enhancement device or something medical.
So presented very much as the source's interpretation of those images.
Exactly, their belief. Okay, so moving on from that physical incident.
Right. The source then shifts focus pretty significantly, doesn't it, towards statements attributed to Trump.
Yes, about potentially deploying the military and the National Guard against people inside the U.S.
And the source points to a very specific justification given for that.
It does. According to this source, the main reason cited was spitting. It's described as a big spitting problem.
Spitting, that's the justification highlighted.
That's what the source focuses on. It includes what it says is a direct quote from Trump. They spit, we hit.
They spit, we hit. Okay. Any other quotes on that?
Yeah, also, nobody's going to spit on our police officers. Nobody's going to spit on our military.
And the source claims Trump said, because of this spitting, what was the consequence?
We're going to have troops everywhere. That's the quote the source provides.
Troops everywhere. And how does the source interpret that statement?
Well, the source spells it out. Everywhere in the United States, there will be, apparently, either the National Guard or the military being sent against people living in the United States. That's their takeaway.
Got it. And this connects to other comments the source mentions about the Insurrection Act, or L.A. specifically.
Exactly. The source covers his reported response when asked about those things.
And did he repeat that line?
He did, according to the source, reiterated, we're going to have troops everywhere.
And the source notes a comparison he made at that point.
Yes, it says he added something like, we're not going to let this happen to our country, torn apart like it was under Biden and his auto pen. The source presents this as his framing.
The auto pen. Okay. So this raises the question of, what's the threshold for sending in troops, like the Marines? Did the source cover his answer on that?
It did. According to the source, when asked about the bar for sending Marines, his answer was essentially, what I think it is.
What I think it is. So very subjective.
Seems that way, based on the source.
Yeah.
And that if they, presumably, meaning his administration, see danger to our country and to our citizens, they'll be very, very strong in terms of law and order.
Okay. And the source quotes him saying they'll send whatever's needed.
Yeah, send whatever we need to make sure it's law and order. That's a quote provided.
Right. So after covering those statements, the source then paints a picture of the actual scene in Los Angeles at the time, based on its own reporting.
It does, yeah. Drawing on its video and commentary, it talks about the deployment of less than lethal weapons.
Okay, less than lethal. Used against who, according to the source?
Against people the source describes as peaceful protesters outside a metropolitan detention center.
And the source adds a caveat about those weapons, right?
It does. It makes a point of saying that, even though they're called less than lethal, in its view, they can still be lethal.
Gotcha. And what about the National Guard presence? What does the source show or describe?
It describes them having military weapons. The source is explicit here, calling them lethal, capable of shooting, killing weapons that you go to war with.
So not just crowd control gear.
Not according to this source. It does also mention soldiers carrying long sticks, though.
Long sticks? What for?
The source explains they're for methods of control, MOC it calls it, described as a sort of first step of kind of using non-lethal force.
Okay. So the overall scene described by the source sounds like quite intense.
Yeah, the source characterizes it as a show of force. Soldiers with rifles, long sticks, armored vehicles outside the center.
And didn't the source mention a reporter briefly?
He did, yeah. Briefly mentioned a reporter caught in the scene and expressed some concern for their safety.
Okay, so that's the scene. Does the source try to give any, background or context for why this unrest was happening?
It does attempt to provide what it sees as the initial provocation. It brings up icy raids.
Ah, icy raids. How does the source connect them?
Well, the source asserts that Trump initially provoked communities. It claims these raids happened in peaceful areas and targeted people who were, part of the community.
Like who specifically? Does it give examples?
Yeah, people working in factories, looking for day labor jobs, it mentions, at Home Depot looking for a day's job, or hotel workers. The source describes them as migrants, possibly undocumented, but explicitly says they are not criminals at all.
So the source is framing these raids as targeting non-criminals within the community. Any specific locations mentioned?
It gives an example from Pasadena, California, claims ICE set up at Marriott and other hotels there.
Doing what?
The source claims they were on the roof looking like they were taking a sniper-style position and alleges they were interrogating hotel workers.
Wow, okay, so that's the context the source provides. Then how does it report Trump's reaction when the LA event itself was described as not a real riot by someone at CNN?
Right. The source identifies the CNN person as Dana Bash and says she called it small.
And Trump's response, according to the source?
Quoted as, "I think it was a riot. I think it was very bad."
Okay, so he disagreed with that assessment.
Strongly, it seems, based on the source's report.
It's interesting. The source seems to then kind of circle back, right? Connecting these events back to something it brought up earlier.
Yeah, exactly. It ties the LA events, the spitting comments, and even that initial fall on the stairs back to this theme of cognitive decline.
And it mentions a specific term, a dementia watch.
It does. It uses that phrase. The source seems to be suggesting these are all potential. Well, it calls them weird signs of cognitive decline.
Does it offer other examples to support this idea?
Yes. It brings up a Middle East trip from 2 weeks ago, according to the source.
What happened on that trip, according to them?
The source claims he didn't know where he was going, needed guiding, and apparently had a hard time keeping his eyes open in Saudi Arabia.
Okay. And the dementia watch, was that their term or did they cite someone else?
It references a Drudge-reported dementia watch. That's the specific phrasing.
Got it. And there was another claim about transcripts.
Oh, yeah, that was a strong one. The source claims the Trump regime is deleting the transcripts of Donald Trump's statements from the White House website.
Deleting them. Why, according to the source?
Because in the source's words, he's not actually speaking in sentences, but saying gibberish.
Gibberish. Okay. So the source is presenting these points suggesting decline. But does it also mention Trump's own statements about his health?
It does, yeah. It balances that by reporting on Trump, quote, bragging about taking a cognitive test.
And what did he say about it, according to the source?
But he took it during his yearly physical, did well, and apparently got every answer right.
Right. And then the source goes into quite a bit of detail about a specific condition, doesn't it? FTD.
Yes, frontotemporal dementia. It spends some time explaining it as a degenerative disease affecting cognitive function.
And it lists specific signs, things it suggests people should look out for.
It does, like slurring words. It also brings up struggling to find correct words.
Does it give an example?
Yeah, it uses that quote attributed to Trump about the oranges of the investigation as its example for that.
Okay, what else?
Also veering into what the source deems incoherent ideas, it uses a shark electrocution example there and an inability to complete simple sentences, citing a Saudi Arabia and Russia will be example from the source material.
So verbal signs, does it mention physical ones too?
Yes, it describes physical signs. It connects to FTD, like impaired motor functions such as a wavering limb and decreased balance.
Okay. And something about stance.
Yeah, often with, quote, a signature lean or arched stance.
Now, this seems important. How does this source frame all this information about FTD in relation to Trump?
Right, this is key. The source explicitly says it is not saying Trump has it.
Okay, so not a diagnosis.
Definitely not. But it follows up by saying you can't ignore the signs. That's the source's position.
And what's its conclusion or argument about FTD generally? It states FTD is degenerative, cognitive function doesn't come back, it only gets worse. And therefore, the source argues, if someone is showing these signs,
Then what?
then they must be relieved of critical responsibilities and disqualified from any position of authority. That's the source's stated conclusion based on the signs it presented.
Okay. So a strong statement, but framed as a general principle based on the signs discussed.
Exactly. Presented as the source's viewpoint.
All right, shifting gears again. The source also covers a completely different event, a planned military parade.
Yes. Described as being planned for June 14th.
And what does the source say about it? What's involved?
It mentions tanks and missiles and significant military equipment being brought into Washington, D.C. for this parade.
How does the source characterize this event?
Pretty pointedly, it calls it a dictator military parade.
A dictator military parade.
Okay, says it looks ridiculous and compares it to acting like Kim Jong-un.
Strong language. Does it mention anything else happening around the same time?
Yeah, it notes this parade is planned for the same time as the No Kings protest.
Interesting timing, noted by the source. Okay.
Yeah.
And finally, towards the end, the source includes something a bit different, right? A sort of personal message.
It does. It's described as coming from someone's experience at a protest in Pasadena.
And what's the gist of that message?
It's really a call to action, it seems, urging people to be visible, be out there, let others know you are allies.
Okay. Any other key phrases?
Yeah, things like there's more of us than there is of them. The belief that love will beat hate, and urging people to show people who we are, that we care.
Care about what specifically?
The source lists supporting people's rights, diversity, healthcare, education, and simply the ability to be happy. It's presented as a concluding personal thought within the source material.
Right. So quite a journey through this source.
Definitely. We've really unpacked a lot here. Started with that physical stumble, the speculation around health.
Moved into the statements about deploying the military, the whole justification based on spitting, according to the source.
Then the source's depiction of the scene in L.A., the context it provided with the alleged ICE raids.
Yeah, his reported responses to how protests were described, and then that whole section framed around cognitive health, FTD signs.
Though explicitly stating it wasn't a diagnosis. And then the military parade characterization, and finally, that personal message.
And just to reiterate, our focus this whole time has been strictly on understanding and relaying the specific points, the claim, the perspectives contained within this one particular source you brought us.
We've reported what the source reported, highlighted how it connects these different, sometimes disparate elements.
So having heard how this source weaves together everything from a fall on stairs and health speculation to specific justifications for military force, descriptions of protests, cognitive assessments, and planned parades, what does hearing it laid out like this make you think?
Yeah. What stands out to you after hearing the source's specific way of presenting and linking all these different points?
Given this collection of claims and events, all tied together by this source, the physical moments, the health questions, the reasons given for potential force, the way protests are described, the planned displays of power, what does this specific source invite you, the listener, to consider about how public narratives around leaders and complex events get constructed and interpreted today?
Definitely something to mull over.
Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into your source material.